Good morning and welcome to June. I have now lived through 61 Junes, and they're all the same. They start off nice and cool and green, and by the end of the month it's hot and dry and miserable. But hope springs eternal, and perhaps this June will be a little different. I decided to vary from the daily lectionary readings and deal with the gifts of the Spirit and the fruits of the Spirit for a few days. Actually, it'll be half a month by the time I'm done. The first of the gifts of the Spirit is the utterance of wisdom. Now, wisdom in the Jewish and Christian traditions is a little bit different than wisdom in the secular traditions or in other religious traditions. Wisdom is the ability to discern whether a thing ought to be done. Knowledge, which we'll deal with tomorrow, is how to do a thing, but wisdom is whether a thing ought to be done. For instance, I can get a YouTube video on how to butcher a cow and cut up all of the pieces and put it in my freezer. But if I butcher the only cow that I have, I've kind of shot myself in the foot. I didn't ask the question of wisdom, whether it ought to be done. As a point of fact, most farmers find that if they keep the cow, they can get a calf every year to butcher, and they can have milk to put on their cereal every day. Wisdom asks the question of whether it ought to be done. Wisdom is always in short supply, I believe, but especially in a knowledge-based economy, wisdom is in very short supply. I may know how to be an effective rider. I may drive around the neighborhood with my headlights off and my license plates removed and my windows blacked out and my car full of projectiles and flammable liquids that I can throw at my selected target, and that all has to do with knowledge. Whether I ought to be doing such a thing, whether I ought to be burning down my own neighborhood or somebody else's place where they shop, whether this even accomplishes whatever vague goals are in the back of my head, that again is the wisdom question. Especially in the Jewish and Christian traditions, wisdom cannot be cannot be employed merely in terms of what are my short-term goals. If I go into my neighbor's village and burn it down, I can take all of their stuff. That might accomplish my short-term goals. But wisdom must also be informed by what is the will of God. Is God on board with my short-term goals? And of course, that is always where the rub lies. In wisdom in the Jewish and Christian traditions, it is not what are my short-term goals or even my long-term goals. It is what is the will of God. What is the will of God for His creation? What is the will of God for me and my relationships in the family and in the economy and in the nation? It's only after that question has been asked that true wisdom can be located, because wisdom is the first of God's creations, and wisdom cannot be separated from what is the will of God. So we are encouraged and invited to practice wisdom. It's not an easy thing, and especially when God starts to say no to my short-term and long-term agenda. But wisdom is the first that Paul mentions in terms of the spiritual gifts, the utterance of wisdom, saying whether we ought to do this thing or whether something else is more in line with the will of God.